in the fashion that you described. Jerry, are you there with us?
Yeah, I had some information I wanted to add, just a little bit about Guantanamo. In January 22nd, 2010, there was a final report of Guantanamo Review Task was put out, and they published results for 240 detainees subject to the review, and 36 of these were subjects of active cases or investigations. 30 detainees from Yemen were designated for conditional detention, and I know Mr. Worthington has something he can add to that, but I want to go through this here a little bit first. Due to the security environment in Yemen, they weren't released, even though they were freed to or approved to be released. And there were 126 detainees that were approved for transfer, 48 detainees, and this is one thing that I would like to see clarified a little more through the government, is that 48 detainees were determined too dangerous to transfer, but not feasible for prosecution. To me, that is a oxymoron, knowing law and the judicial procedure, which is what my education is in. That in itself, anybody that knows law, that is an oxymoron in that sentence. Because what that is saying is that, okay, the only way they could possibly come up with that is that they're going off of their own instincts that these people are too dangerous to be transferred or released, but they don't have enough evidence or facts to prosecute them. And a lot of what they base this information on is the Federation of American Scientists reports, and one of those was the report entitled "The Enemy Combatant Detainees: Habeas Corpus Challenges of Federal Court." And just to touch a little bit on what the Federation of American Scientists is it's a nonpartisan organization that's intent on using scientific and science analysis to attempt to make the world more secure. FAS was actually founded in 1945 by scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project to develop the first atomic bombs. And these scientists felt at that time that science had become central to many key public policy questions, and that they had a unique responsibility to inform public policymakers of potential dangers from scientific and technological advances, and to show how good policy could increase the benefits of new scientific knowledge. So some of, I think, what they may be basing this on is possibly scientific evidence, or what they want to call scientific evidence, over the last 50 or 60 years, which is, as we all know, scientific evidence is firstly based on theory, and then, of course, they have to put that theory together to have it make sense. And by having something like saying they were too dangerous to transfer but not feasible for prosecution, I would say that they don't have a lot of scientific, quote-unquote, evidence to say that, yes, we can prosecute these people, but they're saying, on the other hand, well, we think they might be dangerous, so we can't do anything with them. And in doing this, they're putting these people in limbo. And regardless, if they haven't been notified of the charges, why they've been arrested, if they haven't been before a judge, if they're not found guilty of something, then I definitely applaud Mr. Worthington for the work he's doing. And as far as people like Julian Assange and with WikiLeaks, I applaud them 100%. I believe that the government is supposed to work for the people. I do believe that they have a responsibility as far as national safety, but when that national safety starts infringing on the rights of others without due process, then I think there is a grave misguidance of logic and a very serious infringement against other people's inalienable rights that are given to us by God.
Well, what do you think about that, Andy, about the fact that, they're basing their findings either scientific or it's based on, the data that they have captured on these people? And since you've gone through the thousands of pages of information, is there anything that indicates, that there's a solid indication that they should be held because they are too dangerous to transfer, and yet at the same time they're deprived of going to court? I mean, how does one begin even to answer something like that?
Well, that's part of the problem, and part of the reason why it turned out that I was the only journalist who went through all these documents and tried to establish a plausible contextualization for all the people who were held was that I understand that the way that people had been captured had then been imprisoned without rights and had then had dossiers of intelligence compiled against them that, were compiled in very dubious circumstances, made it very difficult for people to know what to think. But, the heart of this is the problem with the tainted evidence. And I think, it's important to establish that there was a task force established by President Obama of career officials from all the government departments and from the intelligence agencies, lawyers, other advisors, who sat down and went through the cases of all the men who were held when President Obama took office to decide what to do with them. Now, of those 240 people who were held at the time, 70 of them, 69 of them, I think, have now been released. 3 of them died. The 168 people that we're still dealing with, those include 35 or so of these people that the task force said, these are people that should be put on trial. Now, I think the bottom line of what we're looking at after all these years is that we have about 36 people that the United States government, successive administrations, have frankly decided these are people against whom we can create some kind of case. We can present that in a way that maybe, many people in the international community will regard as somehow acceptable. We've got people who had done something wrong, and we can demonstrate that. These include the handful of people accused of involvement in the 9/11 attacks, for example. But they also include Omar Khadr, who's a Canadian citizen who was a boy when he was in a place that he had been sent by his father in Afghanistan, was apparently involved in throwing a grenade that killed a U.S. soldier, and then just 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago, accepted a plea deal in a trial at Guantanamo in the hope of securing his release from the prison, in which he admitted that he was a war criminal because he apparently, when a child, threw a grenade that killed a U.S. soldier during wartime. That's taking crimes, war crimes, trials, the treatment of children into horrible, horrible territory that we should never be going to. But, this is an illustration of how even with these 36 people, the cases are in some cases very weak. But the other people that we're looking at, we have these people that Jerry mentioned, it was 48 people initially, who were judged too dangerous to release or to be transferred, even though there isn't evidence against them. Now, this strikes to the heart of the problem that I have identified through my research and that I will stand by, that I'm still involved in, which is establishing that although there may be some valid suspicions in some cases against these people, what the authorities are not doing when examining these is understanding the extent to which people lied about their fellow prisoners in particular, or even lied about themselves, but particularly the extent to which prisoners lied about their fellow prisoners, either when they were tortured or otherwise coerced, or in some cases when they were offered incentives to lie about their fellow prisoners, so they were given better living conditions. Now, I've spent more time than anybody else has, I believe, in forensically analyzing what purports to be the evidence, and this was a major part of the documents that were released by WikiLeaks. They actually put names to allegations that were previously known, but the people who had made those allegations hadn't previously been identified. And these documents are shot through with the same unreliable witnesses turning up over and over and over again. People who, as I say, either unwillingly or willingly told lies about their fellow prisoners, which are then packaged up and look to people who are not examining it in any kind of detail, look as though they establish that this is some kind of dangerous person. So that's a huge, huge problem. And the other thing that Jerry touched upon is that actually over half of the prisoners in Guantanamo now, over half of the 168 men still held, the United States government does not want to carry on holding indefinitely or put on trial. They are people who were approved for release or approved for transfer. And the majority of those people are Yemenis. And ever since a man tried to blow up a bomb in his underwear at Christmas 2009, a Nigerian man who'd apparently been recruited in Yemen, and there was a huge backlash, primarily by Republicans, against releasing any Yemenis from Guantanamo Bay. President Obama capitulated to that criticism, and people are now being held who are Yemenis purely on the basis that they're Yemeni, not on the basis that they've done anything. They were approved for transfer. And what I find really, really depressing about this is that a handful of those Yemenis, and there are nearly 60 of them in total, a handful of those Yemenis were first approved for transfer from Guantanamo under the Bush administration in 2004. But they were not released by President Bush. They have not been released by President Obama. It's now 8 years in the cases of some of these men that they have been held, even though, decisions were made responsibly at a high level that these were people who no longer constituted a threat to the United States and no longer had intelligence value, because that was actually what Guantanamo was established for, was to willingly or not extract intelligence from people. They're not a threat, they don't have any information, and yet they're languishing in cells at Guantanamo 8 years after these decisions were made. Now, that doesn't have a counterpart in the judicial system, and the reason it doesn't, the judicial system has other problems of its own. But in terms of holding people at Guantanamo, it doesn't happen because, otherwise, in other situations, people are held in prison because they've been convicted of something. These are people who are, what are they? They're political prisoners, essentially. They're prisoners of the United States government, which at every level has failed them.
Another interesting thing here is that the U.S. Secretary of Defense Gates said in testimony before the United States Senate Armed Services Committee on February 17, 2011, that the prospects, and this was after it was ordered closed, the prospects for closing Guantanamo, and I'm quoting this, the prospects for closing Guantanamo, as best I can tell, are very, very low given broad opposition to what is going on here in Congress, unquote. And after the United Nations called unsuccessfully for the Guantanamo Bay detention camp to be closed, one judge actually observed that America's idea of what is torture does not appear to coincide with that of most civilized nations. And this is from a judge. And then in April of 2011, of course, is when WikiLeaks began publishing the 779 secret files. And touching on that just a little bit, these were documents consisting of classified assessment, interviews, and internal memos which were written by the Pentagon's Joint Task Force Guantanamo, headquartered at Guantanamo Bay. And the documents are marked secret and no foreign, which means information is not to be shared with representatives of other countries. That in itself is pretty disturbing. When you consider if they have evidence, you would think they would want others to know what that evidence is to show why they're holding these people. One question that would instantly come to mind, knowing something like that, is why, if they have evidence, are they withholding it? That would beg to ask the question itself, is the evidence that they do have insufficient or frivolous? And I want to go back to what you said about people, the prisoners, lying on other prisoners. When you have torture and you are torturing people, depending on a person's psychological capabilities for withstanding something that is as intense as being locked up without even knowing why you're there, that is in itself a form of torture, because, it's putting a person in limbo. They have no idea what tomorrow's going to bring, or if they're even going to be here tomorrow, or, if they truly don't know why they're there, then you may have an innocent person that's going through these things that has no clue why something like this is happening. And part of the problem here is that if you do a little research, and it doesn't take much research to find out actually quite a bit about Guantanamo and some of the different areas, but some of the oldest and youngest detainees, which the oldest at the time of the report I'm reading was Mohammed Sadiq, which was 89 years old, and the youngest was Naqib Ullah, which is a 14-year-old boy. And when you put people of these ages into a situation where they're locked up and their freedoms are taken away without any rights, they're definitely going to suffer some mental and physical anguish because of this. So, and I know it's also been said that originally, I believe it was Bush who said that they weren't entitled to any of the Geneva Convention rules, and then that was overturned by the Supreme Court that they were actually entitled to some of the Geneva Convention rules. So I think a lot of what we have is a lot of paranoia and a lot of speculation on the part of some of this. They may well have evidence on some of these prisoners, but I think the way they're going about it really puts me in the mind of the movie 1984.
Yeah.
And a lot of it also And I hate to say it like this, but it sounds a lot like Nazi Germany in the 1930s.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I think that's appropriate. And, I was listening closely there to the way you were describing what had happened. And, and it remains crucial for people to understand that the way they were sold Guantanamo by the Bush administration, and I think Donald Rumsfeld was the one who most aggressively came up with sound bites, was that this was a place that held the worst of the worst terrorists. And the fact is that, those claims, when examined, have never actually been substantiated even by the administration. What was known from people involved in the intelligence agencies who spoke on the record off the record from 2004 onwards, there was a noticeable article in the New York Times in June 2004, is that only, several dozen of the prisoners were allegedly involved in any way with international terrorism. What the Bush administration didn't really want the world to know was that, they weren't actively capturing many of these prisoners. They were captured by their Afghan and Pakistani allies for the most part, that substantial bounty payments were being paid to these allies for prisoners to be handed over, that when the US was capturing people, they were quite often involved in a situation in which their intelligence was very, very poor. And they were, ending up with all these people who they essentially didn't really know who they had. When they started to find out who they had, then, what they also weren't telling the world was the majority of the people that they captured in Guantanamo were either Afghans, many of whom were just, were caught up because of all these things, or were foreigners who were in Afghanistan or in the Pakistan area, many of whom were involved in humanitarian aid and who were therefore had no connection with anything. But in other cases, had been working with the Taliban in their ongoing civil war with the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan, which had been taking place for years, long before the 9/11 attacks took place, and that for the most part had absolutely nothing to do with Osama bin Laden or Al-Qaeda or any of these other players involved in any kind of acts of international terrorism. But by equating Al-Qaeda with the Taliban, by equating the government of Afghanistan with this small group of foreign international terrorists led by Osama bin Laden, bundling all these different people up together is what the Bush administration did. And, and it's proven to be something that it's very difficult to dislodge, that those very blunt pieces of propaganda that were put about by the Bush administration in the early days. Essentially that, that one that I was saying, these are the worst of the worst. That's proved very enduring, that piece of propaganda. And unfortunately, we live in times where sound bites are very powerful and where people often just don't have, for whatever reason, the time or the ability to go beyond sound bites to examine that, if you look below the surface, it's a little bit more complicated than that. I've spent over 6 years doing this. I can probably tell you why Guantanamo is such a monstrosity in about 100 words, but I can't do it in a one-line soundbite to compete with the worst of the worst, which was just such a monstrous lie. But that's still that's still the problem with the 168 people in Guantanamo, largely forgotten about, is that the majority of those men, not only have half of them been cleared, but are still held. The majority of them may have had this military involvement with the Taliban, or may have been completely innocent people caught by mistake, but few of them were actually allegedly involved in terrorism.